Hello, everyone. This lecture, we're going to cover the lymphatic system. So it is Unit 3, Lecture 4, Lymphatic System. This part is relatively short. Um, the readings you need to do before listening to this, before watching this video, it should be from your textbook. 766 to 777. Okay, so that is the lymphatic system. All right, let's start with the slides. Okay, lymphatic system. Right, lymphatic system include lymphatic vessels, the lymph, which is the fluid, and the lymphatic tissue. Okay, so the fluid traveling in the lymphatic tissue, lymphatic vessels is called lymph. All right, if you look at this diagram, which is in your book, page 769, you can see on the right side this shaded area. That's where the lymph drain to the subclavian vein on the right side. So this side covers the right up extremity, the right side of the head and neck, and part of the trunk on the right side. Okay, so all these fluid are going to be collected, eventually drained to the right subclavian vein. Okay, the rest of the body, the lymph, will go to the left side and drain to the left subclavian vein. In terms of lymphatic vessels, okay, we have lymphatic capillaries, and then we have the larger one is the collecting vessels, and then go through the lymph nodes, and then the bigger one will be the lymph trunks and lymph ducts, and then back to the subclavian vein. Okay, so this diagram shows you the lymphatic capillaries comparing to the blood capillaries. If you remember here, this blue and red part is the blood capillary bed, and these green ones are lymphatic capillaries. Do you see a difference between the lymphatic capillaries and blood capillaries? Okay, these green ones, they have dead ends. All right, so they're not connected like the blood capillaries always connected from arterial side to the venous side, but the lymphatic capillaries, they have dead ends. Okay, and if you look at this lymphatic capillaries, the structure, right, it's a little bit different than blood capillary. Okay, let's see if I can draw. I can't. Okay, so if you notice, there's gaps along this lining wall. All right, these gaps right here is much bigger than the blood capillaries. This connective tissue here is like fiber-looking connective tissue, hook the capillary side, hook this lymphatic capillary to the surrounding tissue. But on this side, you see, only one side has the connective tissue, the other side doesn't. So when the fluid pressure around this vessel is high, it can actually push this valve open and allow stuff get into the lymphatic capillaries. Okay, so if you think about blood capillaries, it's lined with simple squamous epithelial cells, and gas and small materials can be exchanged through the capillary wall, but bigger molecules cannot get through the blood capillary wall. But in the lymphatic capillaries, it's different because this valve right here is much bigger. Okay, so when the pressure changes outside of this lymphatic capillary, higher pressure can push this lymphatic capillary forward to open this valve and allow bigger molecules to get in. So the small fat molecules are absorbed this way because the small fat molecules, they're too big to cross the blood capillary wall and get into blood directly. Instead, they can actually get into the lymphatic capillaries through these valves and then eventually being transported to the subclavian vein and back to the blood circulation. All right, so this one is showing you another picture of the lymphatic capillaries. You see this line right here that representing these valves over there, and it can be pushed open to allow bigger molecules to get in to the lymphatic circulation. So I gave you an example. The small fat molecules has to be absorbed to the lymphatic capillaries and then eventually circulate back to the blood circulation. And so the lymphatic capillaries, specifically in the digestive system, they're called lacteals. Okay, so lacteals are lymphatic capillaries in the digestive system along the GI tract. The main function for lacteals is to absorb small fat molecules right here, absorb digested fat. All right, in terms of lymphatic vessels, I mentioned we have capillaries, then we have collecting vessels. The next one, the bigger than collecting vessels, will be the trunks, and then merge to become ducts, and then back to the subclavian veins. Okay, and their major lymphatic vessels, I do want you to know and be able to identify them from the diagrams. And these vessels are listed on your lab handout. Okay, so we can actually take a look at this one. This diagram, you do have it on page 768. It's actually better. Your book is actually better, more clear than this one. Okay, remember on the right side, the right head, neck, upper extremity, and part of the trunk drain lymph to the right subclavian vein right here. Okay, and the rest of the body, they're all going to merge and eventually drain to the left subclavian vein. Okay, so if you look at this from the lower extremity coming up, there are two lumbar trunks, one on each side, and in the middle is only one intestinal trunk. Okay, and then they kind of merge to a very big merging point. This merging point is called a cisternae chyli. It's kind of like a big lymph node. All right, so, and then continue to travel. Okay, the lymph will continue to travel in the thoracic duct. Okay, remember the trunk merge to become duct. Okay, so this lymphatic duct will continue to travel toward to the left subclavian vein. on the way it's going to merge with other lymphatic trunks. Okay, one is called the left bronchomediastinal trunk, collecting the lymph from the trunk region on the left side. Okay, left subclavian trunk collects lymph from the left side of the neck, and then left jugular trunk collecting lymph from the left side of the head. So the left jugular trunk, the left subclavian trunk, the left bronchomediastinal trunk, along with the thoracic duct, all together eventually drain lymph to the left subclavian vein. Okay, so on the right side, it's similar, but there's a difference because the thoracic duct only goes to the left side. On the right side, you don't have thoracic duct. You only have the bronchomediastinal trunk, subclavian trunk, and jugular trunk. All three trunks merge and then drain the lymph to the right subclavian vein. So lymphatic system is very important because we need to have this drainage system to have the extra fluid back to the blood circulation. If you block the lymphatic circulation, this is one common problem. You're going to have systemic edema. Okay, so in the lymphatic system, the cells involved, they are T cells and B cells. You probably heard about this. They are called the lymphocytes. So they're the cells, major cells in the lymphatic systems. T cells and B cells, they are involved in the immune responses. The B cells, let's say, look at the B cells here. Once the B cells are matured, they become plasma cells. Okay, the plasma cells. The main function for plasma cells is to make antibodies. All right, please remember that. B cells mature to become plasma cells. Plasma cells' function is to make antibodies. There are other cells involved in the lymphatic immune system. Macrophages developed from which type of cells? Do you remember? Macrophages are developed from monocytes. Okay, reticular cells. These cells are fibroblast-looking cells, but they can secrete reticular fibers, and you can see a lot of these type of cells in the lymph nodes. Right. In terms of the tissue, we talk about lymphatic cells, the T cells, B cells, macrophages, and reticular cells. And then the next level is the lymphoid tissue and then lymphoid organs in this system. So we know the cells. Now let's take a look at the tissue. How do you define tissue? Different types of cells grouped together to have a common function. So that's the tissue, right? So, similar cells grouped together to have a common function is a tissue. So if you look at this, in anywhere in your body, like under the epidermis, in any connective tissue, you can see these scattered lymph cells, lymphocytes. Like in this case, they are T cells. There's no specific structural patterns. It's just scattered cells, okay, together to make this diffuse lymphatic tissue. So these lymphatic tissues, they are everywhere, kind of to waiting to detect any foreign or abnormal antigens and then trigger the immune responses. Okay, so this is the simplest lymphoid tissue, just clusters of lymphocytes. The next type of lymphoid tissue is called lymphatic follicles or nodules. Okay, this one, it does has a structure. Okay, so it has always have a center and surrounded by T cells. Let me use the whiteboard. Hold on one second. Okay, so we're talking about a lymphoid follicle. Okay, so if we look at this follicle structure, this is the follicle structure. Outside here, it's all T cells, T lymphocytes. Inside, you have a cavity here. It's called a germinal center. In the center, you're going to have these are B cells. And these B cells can be mature and become plasma cells. Okay, now this whole thing is called a lymph follicle. All right, so that's another type of lymphoid tissue. Okay. Let's go back to this the slides. All right, so the lymphatic follicles, also called the lymphatic nodules. All right, so it's made by the structure outside, always a lot of T cells. Inside the cavity is called a germinal center, and in the germinal center, you should be able to find the B cells and the plasma cells. Okay, this is a cross section of small intestine. Okay, this is the lining part of the small intestine, and then here is more like a muscle, smooth muscle around, and also the connective tissue. Okay, so the lumen is somewhere here. Okay, cross section. Right, so you can see right under the lining part of the small intestine, you have these follicle structures. Each one is a follicle. Remember I said the follicles outside is all T cells. Inside there are B cells and plasma cells. These are spherical structures, so it depends on how you cut it. If you just cut it on the surface, you will not be able to see the germinal center. But if you cut right in the middle, then like this one, you will see more space over here. That's the germinal center. Okay, so all these follicles under the lining along the GI tract, okay, they kind of form this pattern, all right? A lot of follicles grouped together and right under the lining of this small intestine right here. So this structure, there is a name, it's called Peyer's patches right here. Peyer's patches is just a group of follicles you can find along the GI tract. Okay, so these follicles, you can find them as Peyer's patches along the small intestine. Also kind of along the large intestine, and also appendix. Okay, under the lining, you will see follicle structures. Okay, now lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are considered as lymph organs. Okay, remember how do you define organ? Two or more than two different types of tissues grouped together and have a common function or functions. Okay, so lymph nodes are considered as lymphatic organs because there are more than two types of tissues involved in forming this structure. Where can you find the lymph nodes? You probably all have the experience. You know, there are a lot of lymph nodes under your head right here, and there are a lot of lymph nodes on the breast, and a lot of them along the GI tract or in the inguinal area. Okay, so those are lymph nodes. If you look at the lymph node structure, this is the lymph node structure. Outside, there's a connective tissue capsule right here to hold everything together. Okay, and then this one is the trabeculae, that is just the connective tissue extending toward to the middle. Okay, so in this structure, you can see outside right here, there are lymphatic follicles outside here. Each one is a lymphatic follicle or lymphoid follicle. But if you look in the center right here, you don't see the follicle structure anymore. Okay, so we can divide this structure into cortex and the medulla. Cortex outside, you only can find lymphoid follicles in the cortex, not in the medulla. Okay, so please read the textbook on page 772 for lymph node structure. Okay, I just mentioned one here. The lymph node, the main function is to filter the body fluid. So when you collect the body fluid and before it drains to the veins, you want to clean up this fluid. If there's any abnormal antigens, abnormal cells, hopefully you can catch them in the lymph nodes. Okay, so you can see multiple vessels here. Afferent lymphatic vessels have the fluid coming to this lymph node, but only a couple efferent lymphatic vessels allow this fluid going out. So when you have the fluid traveling this way, multiple ways coming in, but only a couple of them going out. So the fluid traveling this way will have a delay. Okay, rush in, but it cannot get out. So kind of there's a delay in the traveling time through the lymph node. This time allows the fluid to stay in the lymph node a little bit longer and for this lymphocytes to be able to catch abnormal stuff. Okay, so this side is the systolic picture for the lymph node structure. You do need to know, you do need to be able to identify the structures from the histology picture. Okay, so I'm going to skip these slides. You should be able to read your book and get all these structures. Pretty straightforward. Okay, so here, all these structures you should be able to identify from a picture or histology picture. All right, besides of lymph nodes, there are other lymphoid organs like the spleen, the thymus, tonsils. These are the major lymphoid organs. If we look at the spleen right here, okay, if you have not read this part from your book, you should stop right here. Go back to read on page 773. Just read about the spleen part and then come back to this. Okay, so the spleen is kind of used to clean up the blood. So this is a spleen structure. Right here, you can see outside you do have a capsule, hold everything together. Inside, there are a lot of small vessels. Let's see if it's labeled here. Okay, look, this venous sinuses, okay? And then you have very, very small arterioles, and then the capillary beds inside of the spleen is made by sinusoid capillaries, if you remember that one. Sinusoid capillaries, the most permeable capillaries. So they have huge gaps on the lining, so actually some of the blood can get out. Can get out from the sinusoid and then spread in these spaces. Okay, and the spleen is made by the structural units. On each unit, you can see a major artery on each this small part. Okay, this artery is branched out from the splenic artery. This artery is called a central artery. And then along this artery, you're going to have two significant different parts. One is this wide area. It's called the wide pulp, okay? And the rest of it is called red pulp. It is called red pulp because there are blood over there to give the red color. The white pulp is the area where you have a lot of T lymphocytes and the macrophages. So all these lymphocytes, they are kind of stayed together along this central arteries and pushed the blood away from them. So that's why this area you don't see blood. It is called a wide pulp. It doesn't mean there's nothing, okay? There are a lot of T lymphocytes around here to push blood away. That's why you don't see blood, red color over there. Okay, so that's red pulp and white pulp. You should be able to identify these structures from the histology pictures. Okay, thymus, all right? Again, if you did not read the thymus yet, then you go back to read from your book and then come back, watch this, all right? Thymus, I only want you to know this, the function is to mature T cells, all right? T cells are made in bone marrows, but they can get matured inside. They are matured inside of the thymus. Right, thymus is on top of the heart right here. Okay, so if you look on a microscopic slide, you can see this is a thymus structure. You really cannot see other things than T cells. So all these dots are T cells in thymus. Okay, so if you can make a good slide, then you can see the outside we call cortex, inside we call medulla. Okay, but both of them should have a lot of T cells, just more packed in the cortex part. All right, that's the thymus. Okay, next one is the tonsils. Okay, tonsils, again, I want you to read your book and then come back. Use this slide as a review slide. All right, there are different tonsils. The one, if you open your mouth, you can see the tonsils used to give you problems. That's called the palatine tonsils. There are two of them. Also, there are another two at the base of the tongue, the posterior, the base part of the tongue. And then that's two of them. And then there is a pharyngeal tonsil right here, right here. Okay. We'll talk a little bit more once we get to the digestive system. So if you look at the histology, you can see tonsil, okay? The very unique structure is it has, the tonsil have a lot of these crypts, this little gaps, right, in the structure. So this is used to kind of trap the food particles, and then once the food particle get trapped here, then it will allow some time for the lymphocytes to recognize any abnormal stuff in the food particles, okay? And also, if you look at the tonsils inside here, these structures are labeled as lymphoid follicles. Do you remember the follicle structure? Outside T cells, inside B cells. Okay, just remember that. And once we get to the immune system, I'll come back and talk about lymphocytes function. Okay, next part is a lymphoid organ. Is called mucosa associated lymphatic tissue. It's just the lymphatic tissue associated with a mucosa membrane. If you remember, mucosa membrane is made by epithelial tissue and areolar connective tissue. The epithelial part can be simple columnar, can be pseudo-stratified, okay? Those kind of epithelial lining, you have a lot of goblet cells embedded in the lining, which can make mucin protein to make a mucus, all right? So that's called a mucous membrane. So if any of the lymphatic tissue associated with a mucous membrane, it is called moat. Okay, so Peyer's patches is one. Diffuse lymphatic tissue can be another one. Okay, tonsils. Okay, follicles along the airway. All these are moat, or can be called a moat. Okay, mucosa associated lymphatic tissue. All right, so remember the location for T lymphocytes maturation? Thymus. Okay, so when we say to mature T lymphocytes, what do we mean? Okay, to mature T lymphocytes. Okay, this means we're going to have a selection process to select the lymphocytes we want to save and eliminate the ones we don't want. Okay, this is selection process is called maturation process. Okay, so this one I'm not going to test you, but I want to give you an idea. Okay, so in thymus, there are many T lymphocytes. Okay, they're all going to go through this selection process. Number one, this T cell has to be able to recognize your own body antigens. It can recognize it. Okay, so once you can recognize it, then you go to the next step. If this T cell cannot recognize your own cell surface antigens, then you get rid of them. Then next step, okay, we already know these T cells can recognize the self-antigen, but they do not react with them. So they can recognize the antigen, but do not react with them. That's the ones we want. Okay, so basically, you know, you can distinguish which one is a self-antigen, which one is a foreign. If it's a self, you recognize it, but you don't react with it. Okay, that's the one we want to have. If this T cell recognizes your self-antigen and then bind to it and react to it, this is something you do not want. You want to get rid of this type of T cells because, if your T cells can recognize your own antigen and then react to it, that's going to destroy your own tissue. All right, so you don't want that. Okay, so only this middle part, the T cells, which can recognize your self-antigens but do not react to them, those are the T cells you want to save. Okay, this whole process, the selection process, is called T cell maturation. Okay, so that's it for the lymphatic system lecture. Okay, lymphatic system lecture. And then our for this week, we also have a lecture on the immune system. For the immune system, I'm just going to lecture on the specific immune responses. For non-specific immune responses, it is very straightforward, and I want you to read from your book, okay? And then before I start talking about specific immune system, I will summarize the non-specific immune system. So please read your textbook from page 781 to and 781 to 790. Okay, so please read that part for non-specific immune responses, and then I will cover the specific immune responses in the next lecture. Alrighty, that's it for today.